China's State Council Information Office issued a white paper on Sunday to make the country's positions on China-U.S. economic and trade negotiations clear. Where are the trade negotiations heading, and what messages is the white paper delivering, and is there still room for breakthrough? To talk about these and more, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Professor Zhang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics and Harvey Zodin, Senior Fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. And that is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So the trade war has been dragging on for almost a year, and it's the first time China has put up a document in full details about his understanding of why there is a trade war, what was going on during the trade negotiation, and where it is headed. What do you think of the document, John?
I think the document serves several purposes. First of all, it articulates again, the benefits of reaching the deal, the benefits or the harms going to be caused in the United States if we didn't come together with kind of some agreement. And with respect to this issue, I think these arguments are not new. I mean, they've been articulated a couple of times already, and I hope the American side will take the message. I hope that they will come to agreement with what's being articulated here in this document. That's the first objective. And the second is about a little bit detailed about the history of this negotiation. I think so far the Chinese side has been quite reticent with respect to the details of the negotiation, amidst a lot of accusations coming there from the Western press, saying that China backpedaled and this and that. So I think it's an official document that clarifies a lot of those confusion. And the third thing I think is most important is it lays out the three conditions moving into this negotiation that China wants to conduct agreement if we ever come to agreement. And these conditions are very important. First, that we have to eliminate all these tariffs imposed so far, going back to since July last year. This first argument. The second is that the China's commitment of imports from U.S. has to be reasonable and realistic. And the third thing is that this document has to be, so-called balanced and mutual benefits. By that I mean, in my opinion, it means that, it can, most importantly, it can infringe upon the sovereign rights of China.
And Harvey, this is obviously meant to be consumed by Americans as well. Do you think it is more about blaming the American partner for not talking in a responsible way, or is it to clarifying China's stance on where we are?
Well, I think it's both of those things, and let's back up a little bit. I think there's two main audiences here. One is the domestic Chinese audience. President Xi Jinping talked a few days ago about a long march. And so I think he's preparing the Chinese public for a time of some sacrifice and some difficulty. On the other hand, you're right. This is intended to give the Americans information because Americans don't have a lot of the granular information. But that said, I disagree with the method of transmission here. I don't think most Americans are going to digest a 20-page white paper like this. If I were China, I would do some kind of advertising in various media, some of which would be rejected.
But the negotiating team in the U.S. will hear this.
Well, I mean,
but they're reading the paper too.
Yeah. Well, this message
is not a secret.
No, I think this paper is mostly addressing the negotiation team over there. And the point is that probably they already know this, but I think the point is that to have these conditions go public, let the public know, the American public as well as the Chinese public know.
Let's take a listen what went public during the document's announcement. This morning's 1 hour long press conference on the paper, Guo Weiming, the Vice Minister of the State Council Information, said the U.S. imposed tariffs have harmed both sides, are of no benefit to the U.S.
The White Paper stresses that economic and trade friction provoked by the U.S. damages the interests of both countries and of the wider world. The U.S. imposed tariffs harm others and of no benefit to the U.S. itself, impeding two-way trade and investment cooperation and undermining market confidence and economic stability in the two countries and globally. The trade war does not make America great again. Rather, they have increased U.S. production costs, triggered U.S. domestic price hikes affected U.S. economic growth and people's livelihood and hampered U.S. exports to China. U.S. trade bullying harms the world as it goes against the WTO rules, damages the multilateral trading system, undermines market confidence, and poses a serious challenge to global economic recovery and a major threat to the trend of economic globalization.
So China basically saying the trade war is hurting China, is hurting the U.S., is hurting the world, is hurting everybody. But I think Americans already know this.
They know this. This argument is nothing new here. I think this is within their calculation. You know, it's kind of a cost they're willing to take, I think, from their perspective. So I think this is
really is part of maximum pressure they've been trying to exert.
Yeah, and this is preaching to the deaf ears, I think.
So by raising the voices and also clarifying where China stands, is it helpful for the future negotiations? Because by stating what you are for and what you are asking, that basically raising the stakes of negotiation. You can't back down from there.
Well, we're actually already, I think, very much back to the corner. I mean, this is the last opportunity. And if we don't make a deal here...
So you are saying this is back to the corner reaction?
Exactly. I think there's two purposes. One is to state very clearly what's our bottom line. We draw a line in the sand saying, look, this is where we're going to stop. We're not going to back off anymore. That's the first purpose. The second purpose is that preparing for the public in China that if this deal falls apart, if we're not able to come to agreement, we have done our best. So in a sense, it's setting the stage for a possible, unfortunately, you know, it's the bad scenario of not reaching agreement.
So Harvey, let's look at the three things that China says we will not give in. First is that the amount must be negotiable. No, first is that the
tariffs have to be eliminated.
Will be totally eliminated.
Right.
And the third is that you have to respect our sovereignty.
Right.
Which do you think is more likely that Americans will concede?
I think that's a very difficult question. On the tariffs, I think this is the hardest point.
You mean the elimination of tariffs?
Yeah, the elimination of the tariffs, because Trump has said he wants to keep them on. And I think he wants to keep them on as a way to push China to do the deal and keep to the deal. But I'd like to go back to one thing that John said. I don't think the American public has absorbed this information. That some of them have absorbed it, but a lot of people have been hurt in America. A lot of farmers, even though they're getting $30 billion in aid, many of them are not being made whole. Last week, the Federal Reserve indicated that a family, if the tariffs, American tariffs on China go all the way, an American family will have to pay an extra $2,400 for those tariffs. I don't think that people know that.
But it takes time for the Americans to feel the pain. That's basically the problem. The American economy is still very good.
For some people,
but
not the people at the margins. The people who voted for Trump are mostly the people at the margins, the people who are upset with the American system, who didn't think that they got theirs, and they're the one it's going to affect. If you look at the polling numbers, Trump barely wins the less educated men in America. But if you look at the states, the battleground states, on these kinds of issues, Trump loses in all those battleground states, the states that gave him the presidency.
So there's actually another theory about his insistence of keeping these tariffs. That is because his tax reform is not generating the kind of benefits he's claiming. In other words, with the tax reduction, the tax dollars are not coming in. So he actually, you know, views the tariffs as a viable revenue source.
But tariffs will hurt the economy.
I know, yeah. But this is a totally crazy theory, in my opinion. But I think from his perspective, he probably literally thinks that it is a viable tax resource. So
really?
Well, I mean, this is crazy. I think this is really crazy. It doesn't make any sense economically.
Well, Trump is crazy because he measures his report card.
But he has his team who understand economics.
Well, they're a team of outliers, and so they may understand their particular point of view. But their report card is whether there's trade surpluses or deficits, and this is not how mainstream economists look at it.
Let's also listen in to a message from the Information Office about why China won't budge on those issues concerning sovereignty. Let's take a listen.
The white paper also stresses that a precondition for concluding an agreement that during consultations, a country's sovereignty and dignity must be respected. Any agreement reached by the two sides must be based on equality and mutual benefit. China will not back down on major issues of principles.
He didn't specify what clauses or articles concerning sovereignty, but there are a lot of press reports on whether those enforcement mechanisms should be included in the legislature or should be stayed on the administrative policies. Do you think there is negotiable room for that?
No. I think there's something like this is absolutely not acceptable. I mean, this is a matter of national sovereignty, and no government in China is going to back off from that position. But however, having said that, I think there are actually creative ways of getting around this.
What are those?
Well, I mean, that doesn't mean that China is not going to use the legislative approach to address these issues. That doesn't mean that, okay? But it's actually wrong to stay in a document like this with a foreign government to commit to that before the law is being passed, right? So there's actually, in my opinion, there's actually creative.
So you're saying there is still a respective way for us to resolving the differences.
I think
although
on this third
it
issue,
seems unlikely at this point.
Well, I think on this issue, there are actually, in my opinion, there are creative ways of getting around this. In other words, we can, commit these things in a way that can convince the American side, but at the same time without in statutory terms, infringing upon China's sovereign rights.
But let's look at the latest development from the Chinese side. You earlier said that China has been backed into the corner. It seems China now has been stepping up the retaliatory policies and efforts. The Ministry of Commerce announced Friday that the country would release a non-reliable entity list that include foreign companies, probably American companies, that violated the laws of commercial contracts, that violated China's national security. What do you have in mind about what might include it on that list? Will Google be back on that list? Will FedEx be on that list?
Well, here's my opinion about this issue. Originally, Huawei was never part of this negotiation, and Huawei.
This is a retaliatory measures against what they do to Huawei.
This is clearly a tit-for-tat technique, strategy in response to Americans' action against Huawei. So originally, Huawei was never part of the negotiation agenda, and Huawei doesn't want to be like that. Huawei as a company doesn't want itself to be part of this negotiation. But it's because Donald Trump used this card. He dragged this into the negotiation, and he said probably Huawei is part of the negotiation. So he's making Huawei into a political issue during the two sides negotiation. And for that, okay, you introduce a new matter, we are going to introduce another new matter.
Is this fighting fire with fire?
I think we have to do something about this, right? I mean, Huawei is really being targeted unfairly, in my opinion. I mean, the things that they are waging against Huawei for these two matters, these two lawsuits in Manhattan and in Seattle, they are like 7, 8 years ago. And these are things that the U.S. government could have taken action a long time ago, but it didn't. They're starting to take these, initiate these lawsuits right now. And why is that? It's clearly using this as a bargaining chip.
So if that is the case, Harvey, what would corporate America do in response?
Corporate America has been quite silent until recently.
I wonder why.
Well, I wonder as well. I mean, President Trump seems to have a way of frightening people, both frightening his Republican Party to bend them to his will, and also to corporate America. Maybe they're looking at the economy and it's getting better.
But the exposure of corporate America to China is so huge. They cannot come out of this without being harmed deeply.
Correct. And I think once they see who gets on the first few companies that get on this list, I mean, I think FedEx will be one just because they're hanging out there. Apple has been mentioned as well. And Apple maybe is the company that takes the biggest hit in many ways. I think the fact is that we're descending down a slippery slope with a terrible ending. And so I think corporate America should have acted before. But I think they see now that the end point is very ugly, or is really an end point.
What I've been thinking is that the corporate America has been silent so far because they're probably hopeful that Donald Trump is pushing something they also like, right? So that's why they've been quite silent. But the problem is that this thing is getting out of control. And they can't just sit back and hope the administration can work out something. If they don't mobilize their resources, it's not going to happen. I mean, when I talk about corporate America speaking up, right, I mean, they have to speak up in Washington, D.C. They have to mobilize their resources in their congressional districts. They have to call up the congressmen. They have to call up the senators to say, look, you know, this is getting out of control.
But you have to know this is still very political toxic in America if they do that in support of their China exposure.
Of course, I mean, this is for free trade and for jobs in America as well. We're talking about exports of American goods to China. We're talking about shipping goods from China to America. And we're talking about the $700 to $1,000 that average American family has to pay. So there's a legitimate cost as a political movement that we have to do something about it.
So, John, you think corporate America will read this white paper as also a call out to them?
I hope so. I hope so. I think we're getting into a very dangerous moment right now. If they don't react, if they don't act right now, it's now or never. And eventually, you know, it's ugly situation will unfold.
I don't think it's the situation, the white paper is it'll make a difference. But I think the problem was that President Trump, all during this year plus of negotiations, made very positive comments generally about the situation, that he was hopeful and everything. I'm sure that the companies in America behind the scenes were making the lobbying calls and this kind of thing, but now is the time for this to have to get out in the public. It's crisis time.
Another question is, how far will China go to put squeeze on businesses here in China? American businesses, because in a statement posted on a website last Wednesday, China's National Development and Reform Commission said there is a possibility of action on rare earth minerals, which are crucial for high-tech manufacturing. And China provided 80% of rare earth for the whole world. So this is threatening China could cut off rare earth supply if America goes even further?
Right. Well, we mentioned two issues. One is whether China is going to take action on corporate America's operation here in China. I hope not. I think this is the last bedrock of economic relation between these two countries. If corporate America in China is getting hurt, I think the foundation of a Sino-U.S. relationship will be gone.
And it's not in the interest of China.
It's not in the interest of China. We wouldn't want to do this, really. This is the first thing. Second thing, about the rare earth issue, I think that's a separate matter. And I think the Chinese government's position is that this can be potentially used as a way of gaining some negotiation position, getting to the summit in Tokyo, in Osaka, I'm sorry, in Japan. But honestly, I have some doubt about the effectiveness of this strategy, because, as you know, there's a U.S. was self-sufficient in rare earth resources before the Mountain Pass mine was being closed down. So I think they can open that operation. They can use the materials from that operation to do.
But in the near term,
it's going to be a pain.
I think China has an advantage on this one because yes, other countries have these rare earths, but China is about the only country that has the processing ability, and so those countries send China the
everybody has a processing capability. The problem is that this operation is very polluting. It's a very dirty operation. Nobody wants to take the cost of doing this.
Let's talk about the technicality of the negotiations. This is the first time China has clarified what happened during the negotiations, and Chinese Vice Commerce Minister Wang Shouwen pointed that out. The U.S. has backtracked several times.
So for many issues raised by the U.S. side, the Chinese side has overcome various difficulties and come up with practical measures. However, when you give them an inch, the U.S. wants a yard. So the U.S. insists on their unreasonable high requests, and they insist that some compulsory requirements that interfere China's sovereignty should be included in the agreement. They also insist that some tariff measures will remain put in place after the conclusion of the agreement. And they also increase tariff hikes in order to exert pressure on China, leading to the escalation of the frictions and the severe setback of our negotiations. So all these facts have shown very clearly that who should take responsibility for the current status of the negotiations.
So this is basically about who flip-flops. What do you think is behind this issue? Why people are arguing who's backpedaling?
My opinion is that probably we'll never know. You know, it's really me against you kind of argument, and I think this negotiations are highly classified.
Is that normal? This should be what is happening in a negotiation.
Absolutely, I agree. I think it should be like that. I mean, the point. I think the point of arguing about who backpedaled first and who backpedaled is a moot issue. You know, we haven't come to this agreement. Anything can happen. Right? Anything can happen. So you know, this is actually. It's a moot issue to argue about, you know, pointing fingers who is...
And also win political points back home.
Right. This is not the right way of going to... I mean, the objective here is to reach an agreement, right? It doesn't make much point of, you know, pointing fingers.
We'll never know, or historians may know in a couple generations forward. But I think another point that worries me is if you look at Trump's history as a businessman and as president, the agreements he makes are not necessarily kept. So as a businessman, he was very litigious. He didn't keep contracts that he made. In his first days of office, after President Obama, President Xi worked very hard on the Paris Climate Accords. He pulled out of that. He pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I worry, even if there's a negotiation, a pretty agreement, with Trump's signature, is he going to honor it?
It's a credibility test of both sides.
Yeah, I just want to add one note here about the issue of China's commitment of imports from the U.S. On this issue, I think it's very clear. Definitely, the United States have backpedaled because the amount of...
They had agreed on Buenos Aires.
Right, exactly. They have an agreement over there. Now they want to change that, and they want to change that because the
trade volume changed.
The trade deficit is actually increasing since that time.
But that changes all the time.
It changes all the time, yeah. But also, if you look at the three conditions articulated in this document, I think China actually made a subtle difference here. China didn't stick to that position anymore.
Yeah, it is negotiable.
It's negotiable. So this issue is negotiable.
But going down the road, do you think there is still possibility that they will at least come to have another round of negotiations? Do you think President Xi and President Trump will probably meet in Japan at G20? Would that happen?
Oh my goodness, I've been accused of being too optimistic, so I'm a bit cautious of being optimistic again. I still believe there's a possibility that, well, certainly I think they will meet. It looks like all indications point to the fact that they're going to meet, I think. And if they meet, I think there's a possibility that the agreement will be made. At least.
I don't think they would meet unless there was a good purpose for meeting. It's
yeah. You don't even believe
they're not going to tell jokes to each other. So they're going to try to come to some solution.
Because we have seen it in Hanoi between Kim and Trump.
Exactly. Even if they meet, doesn't mean that there's agreement going to be reached.
No, but it means there's a possibility of restarting or focusing on certain areas or delineating where they maybe can make some progress. So I think I'm not prepared to be optimistic on this, but I'm optimistic they're talking.
I want to spend some time to talk about the collateral damage. A lot of countries in Asia and elsewhere worried about the prospect. Recently, Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia said, the talks have to happen to resolve the trade conflicts between China and U.S. He mentioned the U.S. cannot forever be the supreme nation in the world that have all the best things in the world. And this is probably the basic differences of perception between Chinese and Americans. Americans think we will be the exceptional country in the world for probably another 100 years.
No, that's American
and China said not necessarily so.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, America is famous for its American exceptionalism. Harvey, you know this much better. It's a country on a hill, you know, and all this kind of argument. But I think Mahdi interprets this trade war in the broader context of United States viewing China as a rising power, or in their language, a revisionist power, and that he wants to keep China down, contain China on all aspects, economically, technologically, and from a national power perspective. And I think Mahdi is making the argument that it's not going to happen. Historically, it never happened like that. A rising nation, you know, unless something unfortunate happens,
But the problem is, American policymakers probably wouldn't listen to those arguments.
That's correct. And I think we're well into the problem of the Thucydides trap. 12 out of 16 countries that have faced a situation of a rising power challenging an established power have gone to war. I really worry about that, but this would be the war to end all wars because of the consequences. So I'm really very worried about the situation.
There is one difference, though, and if you compare actually I made this argument last time when we were in Bangkok. China and U.S., the relationship is very different from the historic Thucydides traps that we've seen, mainly because our economic ties, right? We have an expanding trade relationship, in the amount of $800 billion. We have an extensive investment from corporate America in China. These are, $500 to $600 billion of interest. So this is a bridge that combines these two countries.
No, I don't agree with that.
But the problem is, those politicians will probably make decisions based on different principles and calculations. For example, Lee Hsien Loong, Singapore Prime Minister, said that basically the fundamental problem between the U.S. and China is mutual lack of strategic trust. What is happening on the technological front is basically that.
Right.
They don't trust Huawei to be a company they can rely on, and now Huawei is facing a big problem operating in the world. Do you think there is really a bifurcation of technological, not only standards, tools, basic operating systems in the whole world, parallel universes in the world?
I think it's already happening. I think technological decoupling is already happening, and it's going to happen in more prominently, because from now on, there's no trust anymore. We used to have this global value chain. Companies, contribute to the making of these standards. They have, division of labor as well as.
So this is destined to happen.
Now,
no turning back.
Now nobody has any trust anymore. Everybody is developing its own technologies. We can't trust on the other side of, being partly responsible for one piece of the global value chain. But everybody's relying on their own technology.
But still, people hope that this is just bargaining chips. They still can come together and have an agreement.
Never is a long time.
No.
So it might reverse with different parties, with different philosophies. But it's very worrisome the way that it's going. And we've seen just in a few short years how our global system is under attack and is being pulled apart piece by piece. So I don't think it's about strategic confidence or trust in each side. Even if this trade war were solved at the end of this month, there still would be problems with South China Sea.
Then that means
and
a
other
lot
things.
of countries in the world have to pick sides. And do you think they might think again and try to persuade the two big powers not to do that?
Well, they've been trying desperately, but
It won't work.
But it's not going to work. But Donald Trump is bent on tearing apart, in my opinion, all the international institutions and other governance systems. This is something that the United States established in the first place, and now he wants to tear them apart. America first means America alone, and this is very unfortunate.
And Harvey, you are also pessimistic?
Yes, I'm pessimistic on that regard. Yeah, I'm really worried. We need to work with each other because the consequences are too severe if we don't.
Okay. Yeah, it's going to be a very costly and chaotic world order. Thank you very much, John and Harvey, and thank you for watching. This is Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Goodbye for now.